thrilling for Susie's work to be getting an international audience. But the work started here in Australia at Griffin Theatre Company with Sheridan. Sheridan is the originator of this work. The OG. So Sheridan, tell us a little bit, I think maybe just because we've been having these conversations about monologues and it's a 100-minute monologue, guys. So you got to do what, 5 to 7 minutes? And you can work your way up to this. How do you begin to tackle a monologue of this scale as an actor?
Oh, for this one, I did a lot of research. For me to embed a monologue in the world in my head has to be so rich. I have to be seeing exactly who I'm talking to, where I am, so I do a lot of that kind of like just mind work of knowing who I'm talking to, and it's often I'll just pick someone in my life that I go, oh, that person's like that, or someone who I've met before. I think with and it's so much easier to learn if you actually are going through your own logic that you've made. So I don't start with sort of trying to learn a scene. I start with going, what room am I in, all that kind of thing, to try and get that, and to find the logic of why it's a monologue, like who you're talking to and why helps also embed the kind of reality for the audience and for yourself.
You've gone through a number of logics over the years. So this play's been going for 4 years now. And talk to us a little bit about the different kinds of logics that you created at different times and how they worked.
Because I honestly don't think Susie has worked out the logic in this script. I think it changes a little bit. And when I was in a bigger venue, say like when we were at Melbourne Theatre Company, it was a bigger space. To me, the audience wasn't there. I was merely speaking my inner monologue. And people just happen to be hearing it. Whereas when it comes to a smaller venue, or if the audience is sort of on either side of me, in some venues I've had a more in the round situation, I actually have to talk to people to have the reason to be given that space. So I'll switch it to, you are sharing it with me. It doesn't change any of the text, but it changes my kind of inner pathway through it.
How did you work with Lee? Was there a process of script analysis, of beating out the play, breaking it down?
The first day of rehearsals, the script went for 3 hours. I couldn't even move my tongue by the time I got to the final scene. I was like, a human can't talk for this long. So we spent the first week cutting it down to 90 minutes, really. And finding out just the essentials of what you need to say. There's a lot of repetition in it, and you sort of got to choose what repetition is good repetition, what has a cumulative effect, and what you just don't need. And even in this season, I've been sort of trimming more, and Susie has rewritten parts of it for this run as she's learned more. So it's still modifying over the years. It's been changing.
Yeah, so it's a living, breathing thing. It's never just static. I mean, and I guess that's the ephemeral nature of theatre. Every time you get up on stage, it's a new day, it's a new performance, a new audience, and that logic is shifting to the dynamic of the room and to the space is an interesting thing. I don't want to like hog I'll just get us started, but I think it's time to just sort of, we've got a lot of people in the room, and I'm sure we'll have some questions and comments. Does anyone want to start us off? Who's going to be our brave first? Oh,
I will.
Thank you.
I heard on radio that you went to some court cases. With the script, did you actually kind of see that play out when you're in court? Like, that's exactly how the scripts, Susie wrote the play?
So when I was preparing, I went and sat in court. You can just sit and watch, which I actually didn't even know. I'm a total muggle when it comes to law before I started this. And the thing with this particular case, Susie was a lawyer, the play was a lawyer, and her husband is a Supreme Court judge. So what she did do is make sure the script was painfully accurate. She really didn't want to take any theatrical license because she never wanted a lawyer to sit in the room and go, oh, well, that's not how it happens, and remove themselves. She really wanted anyone in the law to be really sitting through the real experience. So she was super careful in how that was plotted. And the thing is this is contracted into this, what would have been she would have been on the stand for 3 days, that would contracted into this. But I was seeing in court cases that were going for 12 weeks. And so that person on the stand is just going through this laborious, level of exhaustion, which is sort of extraordinary, and I think changes. The jury are exhausted, they're exhausted. But what I did really find kind of great was how theatrical the lawyers could be. There was one person came in, it was a magistrate court, this one where they come in and they literally, the trial goes 15 minutes, they hear everything and the judge makes a decision on the spot. And those ones were really theatre. One person came in and just went bang, 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 and I actually went to clap. I was like, they were so amazing. But then there were others that were like these bumbling fools, and I was like going, give it to me, I'll do it. This is someone's life. I found it very interesting about, there's really is a cult of personality with that, with the lawyers in some instances of going, who is a good showman and who's a good storyteller. I thought was really fascinating. And there was one case I watched where the jury could write notes and pass them up to the judge with questions, and they really were asking questions as if they had just watched a lot of CSI, and the judge kept, the room would keep laughing, and you go, oh, the jury is so kind of, it's like contaminated by seeing law on TV that they almost have a different expectation that gets subverted. So it was really fascinating, and I sort of went through phases of my own feelings. At first I watched it and was shocked at how you get to watch very personal information. One, they were reading out the notes from his psychologist, and which were about suicide and stuff like that, and I went, that's evidence that we, as the community, get to come in and listen to. And then after a while you get quite desensitized to it. You're like, they're guilty. And then it sort of culminated with I walked into a sentencing. Someone had already been found guilty. It was the sentencing. And I just walked in, sat down, and I realised I was sitting in amongst that person's family, and they were all sobbing. And then I felt like a real, imposter, and went, I need to get out now. So it's really worthwhile sitting in to see the sort of the arm of justice, how it works. It's quite a machine. So many people involved. Yeah.
And speaking to some lawyers who were in the house last night, and I asked them, how did you track through the experience? And every one of them said, oh yeah, that's true. It feels really true when you, tracking through the story. Yeah. Thanks. Some other questions? Someone at the back. Thank you.
Yeah. I guess the play, it's really very accurate. It's got a message there. But on the other side, it just sort of feels like the thing that has to change the most is the culture around the law. But the kind of norms and the kind of ego feedback that comes with, that role and everything, it just seems to me that would be a very difficult thing to break down, or
yeah, the gamification of it. Yeah. Absolutely. I think how could that ever be unentrenched when the role of a lawyer is so competitive? It's results based, and the very idea is that you don't think if they're guilty, you poke the holes in the case, you tear it apart. So therefore you're going to tear apart the witness on the stand to try and make that work for you. It is a system where it's literally preying on other people's mistakes in the arm of the law, not actually what happens between. And you just think if people don't have the money, it's so okay for people who have money to have incredible poor representation. It's painful. But what Susie, it's not within the script. She's provoking a question. But what Susie would talk about, which I thought was really interesting, was the experience of the witness on the stand does not have to be so brutal. And there are other countries that have specific sex assault courts where the way the victim is treated is handled differently, and Australia is behind in that. And right now Australia, and we get this from the UK where our system has come from, it is you would try a sex assault case exactly how you would try a robbery. And she's going, that is a male idea, that it is a grievance and it must be looked at the same way, whereas we know that the way that if someone's house has been robbed, it's going to be a very different emotional space on the stand than someone who's experienced that violence themselves. So there are other courts where they can go behind screens. They can do it as a live feed, and Australia's been very slow to bring that in. And she also talks a lot about restorative justice, which in her experience, she worked for the Aboriginal Legal Service for years and took years and years worth of like historical statements of historical sex assault, which was really shaped who she is and why she sort of left the law. She sort of couldn't handle the lack of justice those people inevitably get. But she found that most of her clients wanted restorative justice, which is the idea of they don't want to take the person to court, they don't need a guilty conviction, they want a private conversation mediated where that person admits what they did and they can tell them the effect it had on their life. And that person walks away with no record, but that person has gotten to have their experience out in the world and acknowledged. So that's sort of what she thinks we should be moving towards, is more restorative justice. But I was chatting to a lawyer in Melbourne who had been in a trial where the victim got to do their testimony from another room. They didn't have to face the person they were accusing, and she found it did not work. The jury did not have sympathy for her in that way. So in that way, like we sort of go, that's a better system. It's also kind of problematic. She had gotten on the stand and said she couldn't fight him off, and that was a lot of the. The lawyer said she was a tiny person and that man was huge, and the jury were just like, why couldn't she push him off? It's like they can't physically see her, and there was just sort of a lack of empathy to that scenario, and so it's a really fraught system. But what we can change is what lawyers are allowed to ask women on the stand, which would come to changing the culture of judges of what they allow to happen in the room. And that amazingly, with the production in the UK, there's now an activist group, I can't think of what they're called, but they're now lobbying to educate judges about how they instruct the jury and what they let the lawyers do to the victim. And I think that's where things can change.
And one of the challenges also is the fact that the defendant is not compelled to speak at any point. So while the victim has to get up on the stand to testify and to go through that process and experience that re-traumatization, the defendant, even in a he said, she said scenario, is not in any way compelled to speak on it if they choose not to, or if their representation.
And I think a lot of people don't know that. I think a lot of people, when they say like, there's so many instances of NRL players being accused of sex assault, very hard to get a conviction. A lot of them, it's a not guilty conviction, and they're often really complicated scenarios where there's been flirting and all that kind of thing in the lead up. And the public just go, if it's a guilty conviction, her story must have been so flawed, but they don't realise you don't hear the guy tell their even worse flawed story. And I think
so they're not cross-examined.
Yeah. And I think there's a lot of naivety that ends up landing back on the victim about that she must have been a terrible witness and a liar. I think that's an interesting perception that the community has.
I've got another question, and you're just talking about that, like with Jared Haynes.
Yeah.
This has been going on for years.
And that was so
and
complicated.
it's still saying it was consensual and stuff, even though he's now been found guilty.
Yeah.
And so, like the play, when you look at that, you're like, well, she's gone up on the stand, they got text messages, they pulverised her, like in the play.
Yeah.
And here's this man who was mistrial, hung jury, went on for years,
Yeah.
and now still not apologising for what he did.
Yeah.
When you see those cases, do you like, when you act out the play, think, well, I'm going to change how I say this part or that part because this story has got me angry or that?
I do get very affected. You know, sometimes I'll come to do a show and I might know that someone personally that's a 1 in 3 in the audience. It's really hard to, you know, they're just in my mind and it's very raw. And there was an instance when I was doing the season in Melbourne. I woke up one morning and on the radio, there was on the news, a woman had been sexually assaulted at Albert Park 10 minutes from my house that very night. And as I was doing the show, I went, oh, she's at the police station right now, like she's doing these scenes, she's at the hospital right now, and that just like shredded me. And that, as much as it can be difficult, it also makes it so potent and important to go, these are the facts, this is what people have to go through when someone decides that they want to take something from them, the way that their life turns on a dime after that. What is, to give some hope to all that, since that Jared Haynes case and since we started doing this play 4 years ago, so many different things are moving and things are changing, and we now have the concept within the law that consent can be taken away, which wasn't there 4 years ago. And that's what happened with that Jared Haynes case, where she invited him over and somewhere in the act it's turned violent and consent was taken away, and they eventually managed to prove that. It's so complicated, it's a very hard thing to prove. Potentially he was tried on older laws though, because they have to, from wherever the year it happened, they have to use those laws. But and affirmative consent laws have been brought in, which 4 years ago didn't exist, and that's, to me, I go, this show and women like Grace Tame, Brittany Higgins, Saxa Mullins have been so important to keeping that pressure on our lawmakers to make those things change, which is extraordinary because that's a big sacrifice that they've made. Yeah, that's all right. Thanks for coming.
Thanks, Annie. Any of our students this morning, any questions you want to ask?
Yeah, I'll ask one.
Good on you.
Do you struggle to like separate the character and all of their hardships, like from like, because you have to come here and do this, and then you have to go home.
Yeah.
Like, do you struggle to like leave that here?
I find the ritual of the bow really good.
Okay.
That really helps sort of like cut it off, which I never realised was an important thing until this show. Also, this show is really scored. There's music going really frequently, and that helps it feel just like I'm pressing play on a song or a dance. I don't think about the show before that music starts.
Okay.
And that helps just kind of keep it in a little safe little box. But inevitably, like when something, you know, like what happened on the news, the woman near me, that it was quite a few hard days of sort of, you know, carrying that trauma. But it's not me, and I just keep remembering I'm doing this to tell other people their story, and that keeps it sort of important and not self-indulgent. Yeah, but inevitably it seeps into your fibre, but it's a kind of an honour to tell the story. So I just go, it's not fun, it's fun. I'll have some therapy afterwards. It's fun.
This was Sheridan's 169th performance.
How long has the story got to go?
5 more shows.
But will it keep changing? Will it come back? Will it be a pathway?
To like the actual just production keep going. Yeah, they want to do more. They want to take it more regional, go even sort of further into towns and stuff like that. I probably will give it a little rest for a while.
Do you think that the message, as it changes in the courtroom, as any small changes come, that we'll keep adapting and it'll come back again 10, 15, 20.
Oh yeah, it totally could. I mean, hopefully it becomes really dated and we go, oh, remember when there was that play about that thing? Things were bad back then. But things moved so slowly. The production that was on the West End, that's now just open on Broadway, Susie rewrote and adapted it to match their system of law as well, because they have a slightly different experience. And also what she padded out was the, what's the word? I've lost my language. The social hierarchy of wealth is even further, and that the kind of nepotism within the law, and there's like, you know, that Damien would have been the son of like an ancestor of an aristocrat, would have been very entrenched kind of thing. I think absolutely it can, because I think there's, what I hope, even if things like within the law don't move that far by this production, what I really love is to think that anyone in this room will be on a jury at some stage, and they'll have a different compassion and understanding for that person on the stand, and for that alone I think it's important. And I think the strength of the work is kind of how complicated the act is, the assault, and I think that's really great for people to see. I think a lot of people will go, oh, I know that's happened to someone, or happened to me, or maybe I've crossed a line there, and reevaluate that. And I think that's important to show that.
Sheridan, I just wonder if we've got some year 12s that are actually performing monologues for their HSC. Do you have any questions to ask Sheridan about how getting into the role, or the transition to the different characters and the transformation, or would that be something you think?
Yes. How do you go about actually articulating the movement that you do, like your facial expressions and all that sort of stuff?
It sort of develops. In the first season, I didn't have any character voices. It was all, they weren't as well formed. And that was a choice we thought at the time was right, that I just said, everyone was like, and he said this, and he said that. And I've slowly fed them in. The mum was there, the mum was really strong always. But the rest didn't exist, and I've slowly built them in, and it suddenly now feels exactly the right thing to do. But in the first production it didn't, which is interesting. We just let that move and shift. I think it didn't seem right to just like put on other characters in the first time, but once we knew the show worked, we could sort of pluck those details out. And for me, I know I base them on people I know, so it just sort of naturally comes. And they're so quick, which is interesting. So to me, I'm doing 40% of them, not 100. And that helps me sort of go, it's just like a touch of them. It's like I'm telling a story, and then he said this. That's sort of the world it lives in. So those things just developed. But in terms of like blocking and stuff like that, we had no plan. I'd just get up, do a scene and go, maybe I stand behind the chair and it's like I'm on the stand. Great. Done. It was very simple to make it in that way.
But it's about like, there is an action in there, isn't it? I'm on, Tessa goes on the stand. Tessa, and this is what we've been working on a little bit this morning, is like how to actually identify what the action is when you're reading through, like somebody just talk.
Yeah. You're looking for potential, not what's right, just what's the potential. You go, ooh, that could be this. And if you do it and it unlocks your mind and the way you're doing it, it's perfect. Yeah.
So there's no right and wrong, as we've said. There's just choices, and you can try stronger choices and find different things. You experiment and you play till it feels strong for you. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. Do we have any final questions? Might have time for one more if we need to.
Oh, that's another one. Well, as an actress then, when you got the play, we were like, oh, this is so intimidating. I don't know if I want to tackle this. Or...
Oh yeah, I was like, this is hard.
Yeah. So how did you overcome that?
I sort of knew I was the best person for the job, and that I had to solve it. And that was simply because I've also done a lot of cabaret, music theatre and comedy. So not many actors have the ability to drop the fourth wall and feel really natural and confident with it. And I was like, well, that's the skill I have, to just talk and to read a room. I'd earned that through many difficult kind of comedy nights. So the idea that I could marry that to my skill in shaping drama, I was like, I actually didn't know anyone else in Sydney who I thought could do it. So I was like, I've got to do it, I've got to try. It's a really tricky script, it's like point form, you know? So it's like, how do you flip it up and make it sound like action? And because I do this, I do that, and this, he says this, right? So flipping it around, and I knew I sort of had the ability to identify that and take it on. Yeah, but it was terrifying. And I still, it wasn't until I'd done the show maybe like 80 times, and it had won awards, and it wasn't until I saw the UK production in the flesh that I went, oh, that script works. I was like, that was really interesting. I was still within it going, oh, this scene doesn't work, they hate it, they're bored. It took me a bit to have confidence in it, yeah.
Well, thank you everybody. Thank you for being here, for joining